How do you expose your photos properly, and what the heck is actually the exposure triangle? I will give you quick answers to that coming up. How to expose a photo correctly is probably one of the most asked questions for starting photographers, me included. So when I got my first digital camera, I usually used one of the built-in modes like landscape or anything like that. So you basically do not have any control over how the camera is exposing your pictures. Now, once I got my D5600 here, the manual mode was actually a thing for me. But I did not understand how to expose correctly. I know there was aperture, there was something like ISO, and there was something like shutter speed, but I just did not get behind that. Also, I did some research and really quickly stumbled upon this term called exposure triangle and dove a little bit deeper on that. Now it turns out that the exposure triangle is actually one of the core concepts of photography. But what is this triangle actually? Well, let me explain. The exposure triangle describes the three important settings that will determine how bright your final picture will be. These settings are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speed describes how long the shutter will actually be opened to expose your camera sensor to light and therefore create a picture. This is what happens inside your classical digital camera. You press the shutter button, then the mirror lifts. That will expose the sensor to light. The sensor will capture all the light and transfer it into a picture. After the predefined time, the shutter will close and the picture is taken. Aperture describes how wide the opening of your lens is. Since every lens has different thresholds of wide and tight apertures, we will focus on the general concepts and don't go into details of every single lens. The aperture is usually described by the f-stop number or f-stop value. And now bear with me, it sounds way worse than it actually is. The f-stop number is actually based on a formula, but don't worry, you don't need to learn formulas again. You just need to grasp the general concept, and I will show you how. So, for instance, let's compare the two apertures of f4 and f20. Now, I can tell you right now that f4 is a wider aperture than f20. Now, we can determine that if we take f4 and f20 and replace the characters f by a 1. Now, what we have is 1/4 and 1/20, so a fraction basically. Now, you can compare the actual numbers with themselves and you see that a quarter is obviously way larger than 1/20. For the practical applicants now, we can assume that the higher the f-stop number is, the tighter the picture will be. Now, the tighter the picture, the darker the picture. The wider the aperture, or the smaller the number, the brighter your final picture will be. ISO describes the sensitivity of your camera sensor to light. The origin of this acronym dates back before the age of digital cameras. There were two standards for film and photography, which were ASA and DIN. Back in 1974, these were combined into one standard by the International Organization for Standardization, or short, ISO. And the rest is history. ISO is actually no parameter that influences your picture directly, like shutter speed or aperture, but it influences the exposure of your picture indirectly. Therefore, we will include it in the further discussion. Now let's have a deeper look into the triangle. For now, let's assume that this picture is perfectly exposed. Now, we can take one value and modify it. For instance, we can take this value and crank it up till the picture gets almost white. That is overexposing. Now we can take another value and turn it down. Now we can get the picture almost black. However, we can modify 2 or even 3 values at the same time to expose the picture perfectly. But there are some pitfalls. Now, obviously each factor influences the exposure of your picture, but each factor also has an additional impact. Shutter speed, for instance, introduces motion blur if you choose a longer shutter speed, and it freezes the action if you choose a shorter shutter speed. Aperture extends the focal plane of your picture if you choose a higher aperture number. That means the part of your picture which is in focus gets larger. Conversely, if you choose a smaller number, the focal plane and therefore the sharp part of the image gets smaller. ISO is a little bit different. If you choose a low ISO value, you will get usually a very sharp and clean image. However, if you crank up your ISO, you might start introducing grain, or also known as noise, into your picture. Well, the perfect settings usually depends on the situation that you're in. Usually you want to focus on either aperture or shutter speed, for instance. Let's take sports photography, for instance. Now in sports you want to freeze the motion to get crisp and sharp photos of the action that is actually happening. Now for that purpose you want to use a shutter speed that is extraordinarily fast. Now in that situation you need to introduce as much light as possible to your picture. Now you want to stop down your aperture to choose a small number as possible to get as much light as possible, as well as adjusting the ISO to get to a point where the picture is bright enough that you can see everything and you don't introduce grain. Except if you desire that, of course. Another example would be macro photography. Now, the macro lenses are usually designed that you can focus on a very small distance. Now, if you focus on a small distance and choose a very small aperture, you will get a razor-thin focal plane. Now, even for insects, that is not even close to be enough. You want to choose an aperture that is probably around f11 or even higher if you desire to. Now, in that situation, you need to stop down the shutter speed to be longer, and you want to crank up the ISO to compensate anything that your shutter cannot compensate. For cameras with an EVF or electronic viewfinder, it's actually pretty simple. You see what you get. That means if you're overexposing or underexposing, you will see it already in the viewfinder and can adjust that accordingly. For DSLR users, it's a little bit different. If you look through the viewfinder, you'll see something like this. Now, if this diagram fills to the left like so, you're underexposed based on the camera's metering. If the diagram fills to the right, you're overexposed. This same system actually also applies to cameras with an EVF. Now I can expose always perfectly. Correct! However, you want to consider that perfectly exposing is maybe not actually what you want to do. The exposure is also part of the image, like the colors and the subjects as well. So you might want to consider purposefully under or overexposing different parts of your image. In some cases, that might be advantageous to tell the perfect story. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you liked it. I hope you learned something. If you liked the video, please give me a thumbs up. That would help me out a lot. And I will see you in the next video. Until then, happy shooting!